See you all. Just to remind you, we're recording this webinar series. So if for any reason you don't want to be seen on the screen or anything like that, please keep that in mind. And for the time being, please mute, and the chat box will be monitored throughout the whole hour. So if you have any questions, thoughts, comments, please send them along. For those of you still joining us, again, welcome. This is the first webinar series on changing political economies in large river basins, looking at environment values and systemic pressures. This is our sort of setting the scene webinar episode where we want to throw out some big ideas and big questions for you so that we get some thinking going on what are the major drivers, what are the really underlying drivers to these political economies of river basins throughout the world, and to really uncover some of the key questions about the politics and the economic systems that change and drive water resources, use, allocation, and access. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Naho Miramachi. I work at the Geography department at King's College London. I've been working on transboundary water conflict and cooperation for a good few years by now. And I'm really delighted to be working with my colleague, Alan Nicol. I'm sure you can see him on the screen. Yeah, there he is, he's waving. And the initiative started earlier this year when we started to talk about a form of webinar series, and as we were planning, it turned out that our friend and colleague and someone we worked with very deeply, Professor Tony Allen, he passed away a couple of days ago, and as a result we really would like to dedicate this webinar series to him. He, as I say, was not only a great mentor and a thought provoker for us individually. I mean, if you want, you can go look on the internet and Google for a very young looking Alan. I think it was in the 1990s in his graduation suit with Tony Allen. So, I mean, Alan has been working with Tony since the 1990s. I've been working, I was working with Tony since the mid 2000s throughout my PhD work, as well as a colleague here at the Geography department at King's. And he was very good at giving us some really grounding ideas on how we really need to think in an interdisciplinary fashion, and moreover that we really need to foreground and understand the role of politics play when looking at water resources management. And Tony Allen himself moved from a very perhaps a more physical geography oriented study in the 1960s when he started to look at agriculture in Libya. That was actually his first start. And by the time I met him in the mid 2000s, he was really pushing forward the idea that we really must understand the politics, and water is subordinate to politics. And throughout this time in the 90s and 2000s, he really developed the notion of virtual water. I'm sure many of you have heard of this idea of virtual water, about water embedded in agricultural products such as food, etc. And I think his work really has inspired particularly this webinar series to think about the ways in which we can better understand the political economy and the changing political economies as well. And whilst it's been a very personally a very big a moment for me to lose Tony and then to dedicate these webinar series. And I was looking through some of his previous books, and the Middle East Water Question, which is now a classic, it's a seminal text from 2001. And I found this great quote that says, "Those purveying the economic and environmental facts of life, which contradict the deeply held belief systems of whole populations, will be ignored if they do not shape their message and pace its delivery to accord with political realities. And I think this is where we want to get at. We really want to, throughout the whole webinar series, look at these deeply held belief systems, how they shape the way we think about water policy, water governance, and the ways in which we can subtly better understand them and possibly try and reshape them as we move forward, looking at various river basins. So I'm really, it's a mixed emotion for me right now to be able to talk about Tony and his work, but I'm hoping that this webinar, this 1 hour that we will have, will be less of a presentation, but more of a discussion where we will throw out some questions to you towards the end. So please stay with us till the end. Alan, do you want to say a couple of things?
Yeah, thanks, Naho. I mean, that's exactly right. It's a conversation, and it's an opening up of big ideas that often are, subject to the kind of academic realm in a sense. IMI is not an academic institution; we're a research for development organization, but we also recognize that these hugely important sociological, political, and other questions surrounding water, that the things that infuse Tony Allen's thinking and his work on policy, for example, in the Middle East are so important, because ultimately they do determine decisions, and decisions determine outcomes, and those outcomes determine how people feel about their lives. So I think, in a sense, this is the beginning of an open-ended webinar series, hopefully, with huge inputs from different parts of the world, different basin contexts, but all framed around this idea that we've got to understand the politics, we've got to understand the underlying discourses, the narratives that structure the way people think about water in large river basins particularly, and that frame the political economy that generates the kinds of development outcomes that affect all of us. So yeah, it's hugely exciting, and it's wonderful to be able to pay tribute to Tony in this way. So yeah, let's do it.
All right, so we'll get going with figuring out what these deeply held belief systems are, and some of the things that we've put up on the screen, which I'm hoping that you can see, is looking at it's a very chaotic landscape, isn't it, right now? When we think about what's happening in different parts of the world, how water resources are being used, what kind of development initiatives have been going on, we see so many of these isms or worldviews. So I'm sure many of you have already seen critiques about the neoliberal water policies of financialization of water, for example. But then on the other hand, that there are parts of the world that are going through a very authoritarian political system, which then has knock-on effects on how the economy is shaped, how social systems are being shaped, and therefore how natural resources are being used and how livelihoods are being shaped. There's been long-standing discussion also in the media about the new imperialisms with land and water grabs. I'm sure you've heard about these. Nationalism, I'm sure there are many basins that you can think of dams and rivers being seen as a symbol, as a nationalistic symbol. Much talk about representative democracy, good governance, that's another ism, that's another worldview, issues of sovereignty. On one hand, we talk about the state, but we incredibly, we also do see a lot of activist movements and grassroots motivations in engaging with natural resources management. And so we have issues or topics around communitarianism, localisms, environmentalisms, etc. So it's not to say that the world is just having one belief system. In fact, if anything, in one river basin, you are going to be seeing so many of these belief systems held between both state and non-state actors, and that we can only describe this as a chaotic landscape. It's going to become even more chaotic in the future, I think, and it's not going to be a black or white situation. Alan, do you want to say a few more things before we move on?
A couple of thoughts. Yeah, thanks very much. Now, this is the UN Year of Valuing Water. In fact, it's been ordained by UN Water as the the year in which the focus will be on the notion of valuing water. So World Water Day was on that notion. And so when we looked at this concept of valuing water, the challenges around it, Now and I both agreed that this chaotic landscape implies it's a very, very difficult process. There aren't any simple solutions to improving valuation of water, to building a kind of governance system around multiple values. And one of the issues there is that these isms and this landscape of belief systems and worldviews is constantly changing, dynamic. Sorry, someone needs to mute, please. So yeah, so there's a hugely dynamic landscape out there. And that's one of the underlying threads, I guess, to this discussion and this debate, is to understand some of those changes, those dynamic elements to this landscape, dynamic elements to the values of apportioned to water, and the way people embed those in their belief systems. Back to you now.
And so I think we'll try and illustrate this with a couple of examples based on some of the regions that we're familiar with, or some of the regions that we've been closely following. And here's, for example, something that Alan has got to say. I think you're still muted.
Well spotted. Sorry about that. Yeah, I want to be very brief because we want to have a conversation with all of you, rather than kind of, expert-led presentations jamming up our hour. But essentially, I'm sticking my neck out here a little bit. It's a complex and highly contested area. I'm speaking as an individual, not on behalf of IMI, certainly. But I'm also speaking as an individual who has no position, as it were, on the Renaissance Dam or any other mega structures in the Nile Basin. Next click, please, now. But the Renaissance Dam is very much emblematic, and that's a term Tony would use a lot, of a national development strategy. Many of you will have heard of it. If some of you haven't, but it will be the largest dam in Africa. When it's finished, it will have a huge economic impact in Ethiopia, in the region, potentially. It's also a highly contested structure. It's being built in the last 10 years, really, and it's generating huge amounts of concern around how to manage it, how to fill the reservoir behind it, and then how will it function? So how will it generate the economic goods and the benefits that are required in Ethiopia? So around it is really a very strong national development conception, an Ethiopian idea of renaissance, which is in the title of the dam, building on years of not having had a major infrastructure, a major hydropower dam in Ethiopia. So creating something new, something able to help Ethiopia move from very much an agricultural economy to a much more industrialized economy. Next click, please, Naho. So within that is embedded a very strong national identity, a very strong feeling that this is a part and parcel of Ethiopia's trajectory into the future, an enormous stepping stone, in a sense, to the future development of the country. And in that is embedded a whole host of issues. There are nationalisms. Next click, please. There are also localisms. There are these challenges of any large structure in terms of pushing or changing the nature of local environments. Displacement is, of course, one area. Changing downstream flows, all sorts of local impacts of such a structure they're embedded in particular belief systems, particular complex value systems at a local level, and indeed competing ideologies of what people think a large structure like that is worth in terms of national development. Another click, please. But then also, these blue ellipses essentially are these kind of large structural areas of competing value systems, competing ideas. It's also embedded in that global discourse on mitigation, on clean energy, on hydropower as part of mitigating climate change, of developing in a green economic sense, a huge structure like that. It's part and parcel of understanding the kinds of development trajectories that have shifted in the last 10 years, that are part of a a big discourse in the developing world about the nature of large infrastructure and development in relation to future mitigation of climate change. So it's also part of these much broader discourses. It's not just national or regional or even local, but part of a global discourse as well. Next click, please. But at the same time, and another one, please, Naho. At the same time, it's not unique. And again, these huge structures tend to generate enormous attention, media attention, academic attention, national political attention, regional political attention, but they're part of a series of such structures. The Toshka diversion, for example, in Egypt in the 1990s was constructed to, in a sense, make the desert bloom again in the southern part of the southern valley in Egypt, to help, establish an enormous great program through taking excess water out of Lake Nasser into the southern valley through the Toshka diversion canal, and part of a nation sort of renewal dialogue or narrative in Egypt that was extremely powerful at the time during Mubarak's era. It was a sort of emblem of developing the Nile to its fullest extent, using it to help an enormously important economic project at that time, or very costly economic project, to develop agriculture in Egypt's southern valley. And the Meroe Dam in Sudan, again in the noughties, the mid-noughties, completed as part of a program of nation consolidation in Sudan. Bashir taking it as a strong connection through to Chinese investment and the new relationship to a China that's asserting its power and influence in the region as well. So again, connected to national discourses, but also connected very powerfully to international political, economic discourses. And at the same time, very much also embedded in some local discourses and narratives on the impacts of these structures. So the connection through to the displacement of local populations, the flooding of artifacts, historical artifacts in the Nile Basin, again, impacts in Nubia, the kinds of things that were seen earlier on in history when the High Aswan Dam was built. Next click, please. The next two clicks were built. The High Aswan Dam was built. So hugely important too in terms of this notion of a structure, large, complex infrastructural, grey infrastructural project being part of a nation building exercise. So again, the historical perspective is very important in all of these large river basins, in all of these major projects. There are threads that take you through from nation building and nationalism to understandings of for instance, Nasserism in Egypt, to understandings of independence and post-colonial state development, really complex relationships between belief systems, national development strategies, and ideologies. Now, the question is, why is this important? Is it something we can use, instrumentally? Is it useful? Is it taking us anywhere in terms of ways forward in development or understanding how to better achieve cooperation on basins? Well, I think it is, because I think if we can map out, unpack, disentangle these ideologies, these belief systems, these understandings around major river basin development, around the political economies in the Nile or the Mekong or whatever basin it is, the Indus perhaps, we can start to build a better picture of how regional cooperation may be able to work. So I put in the NBI there as a critical element in the Nile because it's there. It's an intergovernmental organization. It's been around since the late 1990s. It's separate to Toshka, Meroe, and the Renaissance Dam. So although it's existed and had its own projects, it's been very much about more of the kind of soft cooperation mechanisms. It's existed outside of the national development strategies around Toshka, Meroe, and GERD. So it's brought with it its own set of isms, in a sense, benefit sharing, the idea of collective action, the building of a concept of a one Nile system. Certainly in terms of a systems perspective, it's pushed very, very hard this notion of one system shared by 11 countries, requiring some kind of higher order management in order to be effectively generating benefits for years to come and avoiding economic and social and environmental bad. So again, a whole set of ideologies. Some would say a lot of neoliberalism, a lot of ideas of collective action embedded too in the NBI. So it's another part of that bigger picture in the Nile of what's happening, how those belief systems and complex competing value systems to be understood. And if we can understand the ways that they relate to each other, if we can understand how they motivate people or institutions or actors in the basin to take particular positions on the Nile, then we can start understanding probably, I think, future development trajectories in the basin. And the last thing I'll say is everyone has their Nile. So in terms of these belief systems, in terms of the relationships between them, everyone has their conception of the Nile, whether it's in water security terms, environmental terms, or economic development terms, and national development terms, or a farmer and their minor canal leading to their fedan of land in Upper Egypt. Everyone has their Nile, everyone has a conception of it. And the way that these conceptions are embedded in beliefs and the way those beliefs are embedded in kinds of actions taken at a policy level, or even just at the behavior level of a farmer, are incredibly important in terms of the utilization of water, efficiency, productivity, or indeed the attitudes towards sharing with your neighbor, whether it's at a farm level or regional level or national level. So, kind of reflecting on Tony Allen again, a lot of these ideas come from his thinking around trying to unpack this in the Middle East. And what we're trying to do in this series of webinars is try and continue this way of thinking through complex water challenges, the wicked water problems, as he put it, and see if we can help find some ways forward. Thank you. Now, back to you.
All right, and basically what I will say is a sort of reiteration of all the ideas that Alan has put out, and just put a little bit more food for thought out there before we go on into some discussion. But one of the things that's very interesting to think about is, for example, geographical imaginations as well. While we talk about the river, it's not just this physical entity that we're quite often talking about, embedded in these ideologies, embedded in these worldviews, is a certain imagination of the river being a rich resource that's not being used well enough. I have a picture of the Mekong River here on this slide, where the river very much is seen as an economic tool for regional development, for national development as well. And I think it's important to recognize these geographical imaginations and go beyond that aspect of the physical river, the boundaries of the river, and the physical properties of the river as well, that underpin many of these narratives, discourses. One of the things that I would love to hear more as we go forward in these webinar series and more broadly in our debates, academic and both policy, is to think about history a little bit more. Quite often, these large rivers are loaded with so much past legacies and post-colonial imperatives. These river basins have not emerged out from a blank slate. They come with these baggage of historical agreements, various legacies by colonial powers, and also these, as a newly independent state, many countries have looked towards the river to execute their vision of a nation, their vision of statehood, etc., their vision of how sovereignty should be developed and in many cases protected. So I think it's good to, on one hand, we quite often do talk about policy in very contemporary terms, but it's also good to reflect on these historical past legacies and ensure that the debate that we're having is not ahistorical, that there is a continuity in that regard. And once you start talking about, past legacies, post-colonial conditions of river basins, it's very hard to separate it from all of these discussions around aid structures and development narratives. I struggle to see a large river basin that's completely detached from any kind of development narratives or aid donor multilateral financial institutes and their worldviews as well. So I'm putting these ideas further into the mix that Alan has already mentioned about the overlapping, the multi-scalar, the very wide continuum of ideas and ideologies that are really making valuing water a very chaotic landscape. And so now the ball is in your court, because we're going to be asking you to reflect on some of these questions that we have in your geographies, based on what you've heard, based on what you've reflected so far in some of the ideas that we've thrown out. Do you know of any competing overlapping ideologies or worldviews? How have you come across any of these ideologies that are purported by both state and non-state actors, and how have they shaped the river basin where you're familiar with? Are there better ways of analyzing and revealing these ideologies, worldviews, so that we can better inform and strengthen future development and cooperation in these river basins? These are the two questions that we would also very much like to open the floor now to you. But we'll also have a little poll going on. So if you've had a moment to reflect, please feel free to go to www.menti.com and punch in that code so that you can start to build, we can start to collectively build a word cloud on these worldviews, ideologies that are shaping the political economy of river basins. So these are some big ideas, some big suggestions that we're throwing out there. So let's hear what you have to say, and what kind of reactions that you might have. Are there any comments or questions in the chat box right now?
Well, there's a question from Germa to me about the GERD and diplomatic debates. I think I don't want to get involved in the politics and the diplomatic discourse on Germa, but I think we've got to understand that all of these processes, whether it's GERD or whether it's under the Indus Waters Treaty in Pakistan and India, whether it's in Palestine, Israel, Jordan, or wherever it is, these debates and diplomatic discords about water resources are reflective of competing ideas of what nationhood means, or what national development means, and what national development strategies are legitimate, and how do they reflect on water resources as part of national development. So I think that in terms of ways forward in these complex kinds of situations, as I said at the end of my little talk, I was suggesting that understanding all these different perspectives, ideologies, worldviews, belief systems, etc., is really important in trying to chart ways forwards in terms of understanding what solutions are. And just to refer back to Naho at the beginning, and Tony Allen and virtual water, he called it the silent solution, right, to water scarcity, because when I worked with him in the late 90s, there was this very strong water wars thesis going around, pushed heavily by the media, but it was almost a dominant discourse in the media on water. Oh, the next war will be over water. Well, it wasn't. And part of his virtual water thesis was to demonstrate empirically, in a sense, that this didn't happen because there were alternatives. The silent solution to running out of water is to import the products that you would otherwise need water to produce in your country from overseas. So he was then talking about the import of virtual water into countries that had run out of sufficient water in the Middle East to grow or to achieve food security. So I think that understanding all these different narratives is a very important starting point. I see Alistair has his hand up. Naho, over to Alistair.
Yes, you can unmute yourself rather.
We could even see you, Alistair, if you want to go full video on us.
My hair is getting very long. Need a post-lockdown haircut. Hi everyone. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Naho. Really interesting. I wanted to pick up on this point about. I mean, I really see the merit of disentangling these belief systems, understanding revealing the ideologies and worldviews. I really like that focus. But when I'm thinking about this, one thing that strikes me is there's also so much misunderstanding, right? I mean, and perhaps it's maybe even deliberate misunderstanding between the systems. And I mean, I don't know if I can really, I don't know if you can call international law, you know, an ideology or world ideology or worldview, but just certain from my perspective on international law, one thing is to say, okay, well, there's this belief system around international law and the role of international law, but it's almost before you get to that stage, you have to think, wow, there's loads of like misunderstandings, different views on what law claims to do, should do, shouldn't do. And as I say, I think sometimes, you know, sometimes that's deliberate, and it's a sort of deliberate interpretation to serve a particular interest in terms of what, how particular legal rules or principles or the system as a whole, how it might contribute. But yeah, I just wonder, is that something that can be picked up as well? Is because that's quite telling, right? It's also how people interpret these worldviews, either or maybe even deliberately misinterpret.
Now, just a quick thought from me. I mean, Tony, going back to Tony again, he did talk about sanctioned discourse a lot, Alistair, as you probably know, and the idea being that certain discourses are allowed and certain discourses are not allowed, you know, being quite a powerful motif in his explanation of the way policy emerged in river basins. So I guess you know, and people use international law and the UN treaty and all sorts of instruments of law in very different ways, don't they? I mean, it's horribly kind of pulled apart and used and abused because it's seen as a kind of I suppose almost a yardstick of truth to find a kind of, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's a highly contested area, as you know. It's also not very clear what international law is often saying in certain circumstances. So I guess there are, you know, it's part of the game in a sense. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, so probably better hand to Naho.
No, I think I really do agree with the point that there are cases where there is intentional misinterpretation or using certain ideologies to further support your claim, or to use to be selective in your worldviews. So you select particular worldviews as being legitimate, or certain ideologies as being justifiable over others. And I think that is happening, and one way it could be done is through economics. For example, prioritizing certain goods or placing certain economic value on particular things, as opposed to not giving it a market value, for example. But I can also easily see it with international law as well, using international law as a way to justify these particular worldviews, to forward a particular idea of equity, for example, or reasonable water use, etc. So I think it's as Alan says, it is a bit part and parcel. It's a bit playing the game. What kind of tools are there to foreground or background specific ideologies and be able to be selective with that? I mean, that's almost like an art that many river basins have deployed over the many decades. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point, and definitely worthwhile thinking about the kinds of tools that different governments, different communities also use to do this. I think it basically is an ideological battle, I think, in many ways.
And now can I invite Nick Bourguignon, who's in the chat, and he's talking about interbasin transfers in Spain and the ideologies and agendas that are represented there. And I wonder, Nick, whether hearing what you're hearing from us here, whether you can see parallels or reflections of that in say interprovincial relations in Spain. Over to you. You can turn your microphone on.
Yeah, thank you, Alan and Naho, first of all, for organizing this. It's just right up my alley. And just very briefly, I'm studying water and water issues from a feminist political ecology perspective, but where political economy, I think, is also a very important base. So this is very timely for me. And the point, I think, how it's really important to actually see this connection between the built environment or projected built environments and the values, ideologies, and beliefs at multiple scales by a range of actors that shape those. But I think it's all, what I've seen from this particular case in Spain is that ideologies, beliefs, and values also change over time. So in this case, this interbasin transfers water from the Tagus River, which is the longest river in the Iberian Peninsula, starting in the center of Spain and flowing out in Portugal to the southeast of Spain, which was built in the 1960s and 70s during a fascist dictatorship. And that was part of a belief system which was to squeeze every last drop to fully utilize a God-given resource to make the country powerful economically and whatnot. That transfer has been functioning for over 40 years and 50 years, and has also shifted perceptions and values, even the idea of rights by certain populations over waters that are distinctly different from the river basin that they inhabit. So in this region in the southeast, which has become a huge boom, or experienced a huge boom in agro exports, especially supplying Northern European markets with fresh produce. The water from the Tagus River Basin is seen as theirs. There's even a term for it coined hydro-nationalism. So it doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right, ending the supply of water from that river basin to theirs cannot be discussed. But at the same time, it does also speak to the different actors. Sorry, that's being very generalistic. But there are environmental concerns in both territories that raise questions over the sustainability of such a type of infrastructure. And I think that that's also a concern for large river basins. I mean, when we think of cooperation, I don't think that it can be seen only as a one-end goal, because I think the positive results of a certain type of cooperation can be can still cause problems for livelihoods and values and beliefs of other groups. So I think that's also something to take into consideration from a very historical perspective also.
Thanks, Nick. I'm fascinated. I don't want to say anything because I know there's so many other people, but Naho, shall I invite some further inputs? Okay, we have Deb Center, who has some, I'm not sure if I got the name right, but if you could reflect on the Tista in between India and Bangladesh, that would be really good if you can unmute yourself.
Now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Very brief.
Yeah. Thank you, Naho, and thank you, Alan, for organizing such a webinar series. So actually, what my point was, like in India and Bangladesh, so there is already an existing treaty, that is the Ganges Treaty, that is existing since 1996, and there is a treaty of the same, I think, of the same basin, the Ganga, Brahmaputra, and Meghna basin, a part of the river called Tista, which is also supposed to have a treaty between the two countries. And at some point in 2011, 2015, both the national government almost came very close in signing a treaty. But what the major issue in India is that water is a state subject. So it's under the province, under the jurisdiction of the province. And somehow the state of West Bengal, which is a province in India, is not leading I mean, supporting the treaty to happen because it thinks, the government of that province think that it might hurt the farmers and its vote bank within its own province. So I think there is a mismatch between the holistic understanding of the basin and a very local politics. So there is a mismatch. I mean, even the two countries want to sign the treaty. There is a third, a provincial government who is sort of negating or sort of resisting that treaty because of the fact that it can hurt its vote bank. So I think it's a very sort of, in India, that interstate river that is a federal in a federal structure where it's subnational level politics also plays a very important role in shaping the water governance. Like we have seen within the interstate cases in India, also there has been disputes and there has been cooperation. So again, what in the transboundary water governance, what we call a complex sort of a matrix of coexisting conflicts and cooperation. So it has a very sort of subnational elements towards it because it's a multi-party democracy and sort of everyone has their own sort of regional party domination, and sometimes this is in direct sort of conflict with the central government. So that's a sort of a very unique perspective in India, I would say. I mean, that's a point that I wanted to mention.
Thank you very much. Naho, over to you. We have Charity and we have Simon Thuo. But
I believe we also have Natasha as well.
And Natasha, sorry, yes. Go ahead. You can compare.
So shall we go to Natasha just to loop back on the international water law bit? Natasha? Oh, maybe we've lost her. Okay, I don't see her on my screen anymore. Maybe her internet has dropped out. In that case, let's move on to Simon. Your hand is up, Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, my input is that why is water such a wicked problem? I was doing a review for the African Union PIDA program on infrastructure development, and whereas we find hundreds of agreements and ongoing projects in roads, air, telecommunications, and even hydropower, there were only 4 in water. Less than, I mean, it's less than, it's like 0.4%. And yet there are clear, what do you call it, win-win outcomes. And the only 4 projects there were, 2 were on studies on groundwater rather than real infrastructure collaboration. And the other was Lesotho Highlands with South Africa, which I think you know well. It's pretty clear there is not much contestation there. And this is despite the fact that slightly more than 10 years ago, we had what we thought was a breakthrough. The African Union heads of state meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh made very far-reaching recommendations on the role of shared waters. And this was to overcome impacts of climate change, improve regional trade, improve competitiveness of African economies, and so on. And yet, despite that, we still find very little cooperation. To give you an example, on the ground, about 2-3 years ago, we had a project that was looking at transboundary cooperation between Kenya and Uganda, which had already signed an MOU on transboundary water. And this was a very simple one. There was excess water on water utility on the Ugandan side, and there was serious lack of water on the Kenyan side. All they needed was to pass a pipe across a river, and that became impossible. Yet they could agree very quickly on roads. They could agree very quickly on power sharing, transboundary collaboration in transmission of power. So why is water such a wicked problem? And then I agree very much with the other 2 speakers, I think Nick and someone else from India, about this now becoming transferred to the national level. With increasing devolution in most of the countries, we are finding that there is almost like a zero-sum game, hoarding of water and trying to develop infrastructure quicker than your neighbor so that you can grab the water resources rather than looking at win-win outcomes. So and I think it will be more difficult to address at the national level because, how do you say, it often happens that the development starts, and then by the time the national government is able to intervene, there is so much how do you say, there is so much social and political capital invested in the whole process. So I think the problem is much more complex. Thank you.
Can I challenge you, Simon? Because I know you were deeply involved in the Nile Basin Initiative and the benefit sharing concept. So why is it, do you think, that that notion of the oneness of the basin, the benefit sharing idea, is so easily subsumed by nationalist development processes and discourses in the Nile? And it doesn't kind of take hold in policy, in national policy spaces?
Yes, we have been looking at that even in how do you say, even when you have a much stronger political collaboration, economic and political collaboration. For instance, in the East African community, they even set up the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, and they have a summit of the heads of state. Yet even there, getting Kenyans to collaborate with Tanzanians on the Mara, for instance, or getting Kenya to collaborate with Uganda on certain issues of shared waters like fisheries and Lake Victoria, or just even hydrological monitoring, has been very, very difficult. So I think that there is something fundamentally wrong with the perspective or the ownership over water. It almost seems akin to territory, national territory, or ceding of national territory. So it's not like any of the other infrastructures. I think there are some fundamental changes that, or unpacking of the reality, because the discourse might be very collaborative, but the reality on the ground runs very much counter to that.
Thanks. No.
Right, I was thinking, is Charity still here? I think she put in a comment.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much, Naho and Alan. I hope you can hear me. So, okay, great. I want to look at it a bit from the historical perspective. So I'm speaking from Ghana, and for our river basins, historically, it's been managed by traditional authorities. So up to about 1996, thereabout, the state was not involved. It was mainly by the chiefs and the traditional authorities that managed these river basins. We have about 5 of them. And that was working very well. We didn't have a lot of pollution in the rivers. But you see, these rivers are also of
Charity, I think you dropped out.
economic importance. So now, and it is run by the state. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I was saying that now it's being managed by the states, and they have a lot of rules governing these river bodies, but it is the enforcement of the rule that is the issue, because governments, they want to win political power, and they are concerned about the electorate. So the issue here for me is how to balance the two. On the one hand, the river basins are of economic importance because we have a lot of hydroelectric power being generated from some of these basins, and government wants to hold on to it. But the communities around these basins, they also, want to use these rivers for their sustenance in terms of food, and they are using agricultural practices that are really not helping the basins in terms of a lot of fertilizer going into the river, and also even pouring waste into the river. But government is not able to enforce its own regulations and rules because he also would not want to hurt his electorate. So on the one hand, he knows what is good to keep the river clean, but on the other hand, he also wants to hold on to political power, and he wants to ensure that when it is election, the people will vote for him. So how do we reconcile all this and make sure that we understand the trade-offs, and also develop tools and also solutions that is more sustainable? Because when it was managed by the traditional elders, they were able to set up taboos and also belief systems that helped people to maintain or manage the river basins in a proper way so that we didn't have a lot of pollutions. So this for me is something that maybe going forward, we really need to think through. How do we understand these issues better, and how do we come to a point where we can use both approach? So it's not only from top down completely 100%, but how do we bring some of those belief systems into the management and the regulation of the river basins? Yeah, thank you very much, Naho and Alan.
That's a fantastic point. Thank you so much for that contribution, Charity. And I think it's really interesting how these ideas about devolution is starting to come up there. There's also been talk about traditional management structures and political systems. And as researchers, as people who are part of this debate, it just goes to show that you can't just do a superficial analysis, that you can't just look at the sort of very obvious features of the river basin and the existing policies, that you've really got to be able to understand these underlying historical, very embedded systems. And just a quick snapshot isn't going to help you uncover all of these ideologies, worldviews, etc. But there's a very interesting comment that I saw on the chat box. I think it was by Margot, who was saying, are we at risk of oversimplifying this if we just talk about worldviews and ideologies? And I think there's been a bit of chat going backwards and forwards in the box. But maybe I could ask Marco to share his views if he's still around. Hey, there you are.
I'm here, of course. Yeah, thanks. Actually, I think there is really good discussion after that. So I'm happy Ming-Li Yong and Alan have been already clarifying many of the points. Maybe perhaps just the notion, I really must like this, but kind of, I think Alan already was clarifying that it's about also the presence of the ideologies and how they are manifested in the institutions. That is important. That if we just start to look at all the ideologies, I do think that there is this danger that either we see it as an overly simplified neoliberalistic or sovereign drive of something, because I see that, you know, talking of any dam, for example, there is most likely some kind of a hybrid mix of ideologies behind it, what kind of justifies and drives that, rather than just an ideology or even two. But at the same time, I do think that then it's actually about, you know, there are these different conceptualizations about orders of governance, if you wish, for example. So of course it's about that we are talking at this meta governance level in a way, how these ideologies and worldviews then translate into those governance decisions or political decisions. And I think this is super interesting. And here I think that what Alan mentioned about the sanctioned discourse idea, that which are the ideologies that almost kind of automatically happen to be those that everybody sees are the right ones or the justified ones. I think that's something that is super interesting, for example, to consider whether there are some kind of blind spots among us or in the institutions that we are researching that kind of take something as kind of given, even that it's not even an ideology. And I must say, as a response to Alistair's mention, that I'm a kind of coming from Finland, I guess, I do like the Helsinki Convention and the UN Watercourses Conventions, and I would like to see them not as an ideologies, but rather as some kind of a form of framed institutionalism about, you know, how we should cooperate with our shared waters, taking out of the context. But I think it was really nice point from Alistair that some or even many could consider it still as a certain kind of ideology as well, and I do understand that very well as well. But so it's kind of, you know, that's blind spot for me, for example, that I consider it as a kind of more neutral than what it in reality might be. But really interesting topic.
Thanks, Marco. We have 5 minutes left. Naho, I see there's a point made by Fana about Egypt and Ethiopia in relation to the kind of competition between the historical rights notion, securitized sovereignty-centered discourses, and the outcome being this room for compromise is constricted. And that's interesting, Fana, because I guess what we're saying, or we're suggesting, is that if you understand these, you know, the way that these ideologies or approaches to a national development discourse around water, the way they interact and constrict room for maneuver. I mean, understanding this and understanding what is happening in relation to the ideas in a negotiation process, for example, is very important. Understanding options, potential outcomes as well. I guess, you know, it's trying to say that it's not just an academic exercise trying to work out where everyone's belief systems are coming from, but it's also important in terms of charting ways forward and considering potential compromises in the future. You know, what's easier and what's harder to achieve will be a function of how much things are embedded in different belief systems, and maybe how many times different ideologies reinforce each other rather than perhaps always kind of conflict each other. So we have a couple of minutes left, Naho.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one more comment that I've seen. I saw our IMI colleague talking about a case study or insight from Nepal. And again, we're talking about federalism. And I'm really pleased to hear that while we're talking about large river basins today, we are looking at both, you know, these very big global structures that determine how rivers and how the ways in which natural resources are being placed within this globalized system, but also these discussions of federalism about the subnational. And I think that's really important for us to see both perspectives. Actually, I don't think it's just a sort of bipolarized scale. I don't think it's global versus local or anything like that. I think it's actually much more sensitive to other issues like regional development or regional governance, as well as more sort of locally based, village level based as well. So it's great to see these comments come in.
Shall we go to the Menti?
Yes, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Valentine, could you show us the Menti-Meet poll outcome?
Yes, 1 second, because I'll have to share my screen as well. Oops. Okay. No, wait. For some reason, it's not working anymore. Give me 2.
Naho, do you want to say something about the next webinar?
I would definitely love to say that. So now that we've set the scene, we've got to get the discussions going and continuing. So we have one almost in 4 weeks' time. So it will be on the 26th of May. And this will be looking at power interplay, reshaping the politics of value in the Mekong region, and looking at hydropower development in the Mekong region in Southeast Asia. We have Diana Suhardiman from IMI, another good colleague of Alan's, who will be giving us an idea, an overview of what's happening, particularly in the Pakbeng project. And then we have 2 discussants, Jonathan Rigg from University of Bristol and Yayoi Lagerqvist, who's now based in Sweden at a civil society rights organization. Both of them have worked deeply within the Mekong region, particularly Laos. And so with the 3 of them, we should have a very interesting debate. This will happen from 10 o'clock British summertime, so 10 o'clock GMT +1, in order to make sure that people in the Mekong region can hopefully make it as well. So we'll send out another poster to everybody who's signed up for this webinar so that you can get the details of the 26th of May. You can read up on the short blurb about the webinar episode, and then we'll have the sign up link as well.
I can't access the Menti for some reason. I don't have access to the results.
So I can't share my screen, unfortunately. If you let me share my screen, I can share it for you.
You should be able to share your screen, yeah. Sorry, everyone.
Maybe Naho, you could try with the link I sent.
Okay, let me just. We are going to, as I say, this is being recorded, so we will be able to put this up online. So if you have any colleagues who haven't taken a read, they'll be able to listen to it. And also,
I'll share the link in the chat so everyone can see.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
And then we'll also be able to take a snapshot of the results from the poll today so that we can see. So let's see if this is working.
So if you all click on that link, you'll see what's come up. I hope it works. Nice, colorful word cloud.
Works.
Okay, good. So hopefully you'll be seeing something like this.
Yeah.
Yep.
But we'll make sure to capture this and put it alongside the online version of this episode so that you can look at it in more detail. But I think our time is up. We like to keep it short and sweet so that we get a lot of discussion going. So thank you so much for your participation. It's been a really great hour for me, really enriching, really thought-provoking. And this being, even though this is during a pandemic situation, boy, oh boy, I really miss these kind of informal debates and having these stimulating discussions. So thank you so much for sparing an hour of your day today. I really do hope that you can join us next month for our Mekong episode. But Alan, any last words before we close?
Just to say thank you to yourself, to Valentine, to everyone who's helped, to Upanda, who's going to write a report, who's also online, and to all of the participants for your ideas and your chat contributions. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
All right, thanks everyone. Keep well. Bye-bye.
Bye.